welcome back to the Holistic Trauma Healing Podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, welcome back. I am Lindsey Lockett. I am the host of the Holistic Trauma Healing Podcast. You can find me on Instagram at I am Lindsey Lockett, and I am a trauma educator and a nervous system coach who specializes in complex PTSD. And I recently, just within the last few weeks, started a new Instagram account that is called The Authenticity Witch. No surprising, because I'm doing all of this for the purpose of authenticity. Believe it or not, it's not actually about your nervous system. It's actually about authenticity, which is kind of a hint at what's to come in this Nourish Your Nervous System series, because the last episode in the series is about authenticity. It's called Authenticity is the Entire Point. So 10 episodes ago, we started on a journey together through my ebook and audiobook, Nourish Your Nervous System. We have started with seeing how everything is connected in our stories and in our world. We went through recognizing autonomic system dysfunction and what the autonomic nervous system is. We've talked about reconnecting to your body. We've talked about nourishing your body physically, nourishing your spirit and your energy, nourishing your relationships, nourishing your mind. And this episode, we're going to discuss nourishing your ancestry. I know, right? Weird kind of a concept, like nourish my ancestry. So you can get the entire ebook, Nourish Your Nervous System, at lindseylockett.com/nourish. It is less than $20, and it includes the audiobook, which is over 7 hours long, and it is narrated by yours truly. Before we jump into Ancestral Nourishment, it feels appropriate to admit something tender to you. Well, it's actually not that big of a deal, but my ego feels tender about it. Regarding nourishing our nervous systems and integrating all the parts of ourselves into our embodied expressions of authenticity, which are many. Your authenticity has many facets, like a beautiful diamond. I would say that ancestral trauma and healing is probably the area where I am the least informed. I've definitely done ancestry work. I've done some family constellations. I've read some books. I've done some rituals. I've connected with my ancestors in different ways. But for some reason, it just still feels like ancestral trauma and healing is kind of a void for me in a certain way. And I'm not really sure why. I don't know if that's because I'm subconsciously avoiding it for some reason, if I'm just not interested at this time in my life, or if maybe I'm just being called to something different. I'm not really sure. But I just have to admit that I feel like ancestral trauma and healing are probably areas where I am much less informed than some of the other things that I talk about. But still, I have been fascinated by my ancestry for many, many years. It is something that my biological father and I connect over regularly because he is a genealogy nerd as well. I've done quite a lot of mapping and creating of my family tree. I can go back many, many generations in a few lines, assuming the information is accurate, which I think it mostly is. I regularly connect with one of my ancestors, my maternal grandmother, Edith. She's my mom's mom. She passed away about 14 years ago, and I regularly connect with her. When I do ritual or meditation or I pull cards or something, I like to call in my ancestors who are well in spirit. And that language, ancestors who are well in spirit, is not my language. It comes from Dr. Daniel Four and his book, Ancestral Medicine, Rituals for Personal and Family Healing. I highly, highly recommend this book if you desire to go deeper into connecting with your ancestry and doing any kind of ancestral healing work. So I say all that to say that I am sharing this episode and this video from my own admittedly limited understanding of generational trauma and healing, and as someone who is still very much figuring out what ancestral nourishment means to me. So I don't expect that this journey will ever end. There's always something new to uncover, which is really exciting and interesting. But yeah, if you're open about ancestry and ancestral healing and intergenerational trauma, and you want to go on this journey of discovery with me, keep listening, and we'll figure out some place to go together that maybe gets us a little further along than we are now. So I also love a book by Dr. Mark Wolin, and it's called It Didn't Start With You. There is a quote in his book that I think really summarizes what ancestral trauma is in the most succinct and simplest form. And so here's what he says in his book, It Didn't Start With You, on page 40. For better or worse, parents tend to pass on the parenting that they themselves received. And then they become parents. And then for better or for worse, they pass on the parenting they received. And then they become parent. And pretty soon you have generation after generation after generation of really similar trauma patterns and stories that seem to make up the fabric of a family. I know my family on both sides has that kind of stuff. And anything from poverty, trauma, and the poverty and scarcity story that was created to all of the Lockett men in my family having heart issue of some sort and dying at young ages from heart issues. And they also all carry around a lot of bitterness and unresolved anger. And it's so interesting how emotionally their bitterness and their unresolved anger is mirrored by a physical heart conditioning, almost like the hardening of their hearts or something. I have it on both sides of my family. So, and it's not about judging our families, right? When you understand the context of someone's life experience, the adaptive behaviors that they have make sense. That doesn't mean they're appropriate, but their behaviors make sense in the context of their experience. But when we know better, we can do better, right? And I think a lot of our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and so forth, they didn't have the resources that we have today. They didn't have books, podcasts, the internet. Nobody was talking about trauma or the nervous system until very, very recently. And so I think it's also important to note that, while some really fucked up things may have been passed through our lineages, that we also wouldn't be here. We wouldn't have survived if our ancestors had not had some resiliency and if they had not survived in order to create us. And so just as we inherit their weaknesses and their trauma and their patterns, we also inherit the resiliency that made them live so that we could be born, So you can't really throw it all out because you wouldn't exist without them. So let's talk about who are the ancestors? Who are the ancestors? According to Dr. Daniel Foer in his book, Ancestral Medicine, he says this: in the broadest sense, the ancestors are all the people, human and otherwise, who lived on earth before us, the life of the past that nourishes and shapes the present. More specifically, the ancestors are the human dead, the collective love, wisdom, and suffering of Homo sapiens sapiens over the past 300,000 or so years. Even more narrowly, our ancestors are those among the dead who are well in spirit, in contrast to ghosts or the troubled dead. Ancestors are not limited to blood and family lineages. However, ancestors of body tend to be impactful and important to include. The ancestors, especially those of blood and bone, are our roots and mycelia, and cultivating a relationship with them is deconstructing problematically individualistic and isolating understandings of who we are and our place in the larger web. Oh, I love that quote so much. And why does ancestry matter? Well, you have 1,024 eighth great grandparents. Just 9 generations back from you today, 1,024 people had to live and survive at least until they had the child who is in your direct lineage. Think of all the hardships, the traumas, the victories, the life stuff that 1,024 of your 8 great grandparents lived through. And they were scattered all over the globe, most likely. And yet, your DNA is a quilt of eye color, hair color, bone structure, even sweet, sour, and salty taste preference that you inherited from the threads of each of those 8 great-grandparents, and even further back than that. On the back of his book, It Didn't Start With You, which we'll link in the show notes below, Dr. Mark Wolin says this: the evidence is compelling. The roots of issues such as depression, anxiety, chronic pain, phobias, etc., may reside in the traumas of our parents, grandparents, and even great-grandparents. The latest research affirms that traumatic experience is passed on to future generations, and that this emotional inheritance, hidden in everything from our gene expression to everyday language, plays a far greater role in our health than ever previously understood. So if you understand how your nervous system works, right? How events occur that activate the nervous system survival responses, and then rather than resolving, for whatever reason, the activation continues long after the threat has passed. And that's when we see chronic survival responses coming in, like depression, anxiety, chronic pain, addiction, perfectionism, phobias. These are the evidence of the echoes of the survival response that's still ringing long after the original event is over. And every nervous system state on the polyvagal ladder, from the safe and social ventral vagal state at the top to the sympathetic fight-flight state towards the middle, to the freeze state getting closer to the bottom, to the dorsal vagal state all the way at the bottom of that ladder, is the body's instinctive protective mechanisms. So if that's what happens in your body, and you have felt the effects of that long-term and chronic activation in your body, then all of your ancestors before you have that same experience, and they felt that in their bodies. And we know that trauma changes the size and structure of the brain. We know that trauma alters DNA. We know that trauma literally lives in our cells, in our bones, in our blood, in our tissues, in our organs. You had to get all of that stuff from all of your ancestors. And so from the moment you were conceived, your body, your cells that were creating the body that you would eventually have, held all of that information in the DNA from all of those great grandparents and beyond, right? And the same chronic activation that you experience, even sometimes in an inappropriate or disproportionate way, once a threat is actually passed, your ancestors would have also experienced that. And just like for you, these states in the nervous system, survival states, are always meant to be temporary states. But if they've gone on chronically for you, then you can bet they went on chronically for your ancestors. And that has informed a lot of the DNA that you have in your body today, or all of the DNA you have in your body. So let's talk about familial adaptive survival patterns. We know that when safety isn't achieved, which allows the body to return to homeostasis, the temporary state of fight, flight, freeze, fawn, shutdown becomes a personality trait. Some of these traits might simply be quirks, but more commonly, they are chronic stress states. So, for example, a perfectionist might be socially celebrated for her type A traits and seemingly perfect work. But on the inside, a perfectionist has adapted to the long-held belief that to be safe, to be loved, to be worthy, I must be perfect. No one is inherently a perfectionist. No one is genetically a perfectionist. Perfectionism is a pattern that develops to survive. So if that's you as an individual, think about zooming out and what that means for a family. Adaptive survival patterns run in families too. I don't know how much exactly we can contribute to nature and how much we can attribute to nurture. And of course, every family's patterns are unique and rooted in unique circumstances as individuals and as a people group. But I do know, and I bet you have observed too, that generations of families tend to exhibit similar patterns in response to stress. One really common one is alcoholism. It's a super common adaptive pattern that runs in families. Are we genetically more likely to struggle with alcoholism if we have a parent who has alcoholism? Maybe. Some sources say that as much as 50% of alcoholism can be contributed to genetics. However, a renowned trauma and addiction expert, Dr. Gabor Mate, believes that addiction is not genetic, but stems from childhood trauma and the stress that is endemic to systems of inequality and justice. He said that in a YouTube video. I tend to agree with Dr. Gabor Mate. If you grow up in a home where you're repeatedly exposed to one or both parents using alcohol to cope, you begin to learn that alcohol is an acceptable coping tool. That's what's been modeled to you. I grew up with parents that said, do as I say, not as I do. But that is bullshit because children learn far more watching their parents and observing their parents than they do by listening to what their parents say, especially from an emotional standpoint. So when it is normalized and even celebrated to use alcohol when you're sad, when you're mad, when you want to check out, when you need a social lubricant, when you're depressed, then it makes sense that you would reach for the bottle when you find yourself experiencing difficult feelings. Remember in early 2020 and like all through the year 2020, as long as COVID was happening, when the lockdown started, all over social media were these videos of moms who were joking and showcasing their wine drinking and how they were using wine to deal with the stress of their kids being home all day, doing online school. And then they would have videos of like sending their husbands to the curbside pickup at Costco to pick up another case of wine because another week had gone by and it was time to restock on the wine. Like, it was all over social media. When something is that prevalent on social media, it begins to target our brain and it desensitizes us to the reality of what a fucked up situation that is. And like, I'm not shaming moms for drinking wine, but also I am kind of shaming moms for drinking wine because shame says, hey, you're out of your integrity. Right? Like, get back into your character. This is not who you are. And I will be really interested to see what happens when the young children of the COVID mommy wine culture grow up. What is their relationship to alcohol going to be? What is their relationship to hardship and social challenge going to be? Because they literally watched their parents get through an extremely difficult social time with wine. And I don't get a lot of videos on Instagram of men because I'm a woman and my audience is primarily women. So I don't know how the dads were coping. Maybe they were at home doing shots of whiskey. I don't know. I'm just saying it's going to be really interesting to see what happens when some of these, kids who were 3, 4, 7, 8, 9, 10 home with a mom who was drinking wine all day and even celebrating it on social media. What is their relationship going to be with alcohol? What is their relationship going to be with their feelings? Will they remember how their moms celebrated and joked about drinking as a way to cope during a world crisis? So is it nature, which is genetics, or is it nurture, which is what's modeled? Probably a mix of both, right? But even still, we see these things run in families, whether it's modeling or it's in the DNA. We see these things running in families. And I think we're doing ourselves a massive disservice when we jump straight to blaming genetics without being open to the possibility that we have more power and choice over some of these patterns than we realize, especially when we meet them with curiosity and conscious awareness. So when things like poverty, abuse, addiction, alcoholism, sexual abuse, bigotry, misogyny, codependency, unemployment, and mental illness seem to run in the family, that's ancestral trauma. But those are big things, right? Also look and see what behavioral patterns or nervous system states run in your family. Does anxiety run in the family? Does depression run in the family? Does panic disorder run in the family? OCD, perfectionism, the type A personality, narcissism, right? We got to look at all the different patterns that we see running through our family line to get clarity. So what's repeating in your family? That's what needs healing. You can't do that with anybody else in your family before you. It starts with you, and your healing has a ripple effect in the past, and it has a ripple effect in the future. So alcoholism and addiction are really common patterns that run in families. They certainly run on both sides of mine. Alcoholism and addiction aren't about the substances. It's not about like how much a person loves alcohol or how much a person loves drugs. The reason people are addicts and alcoholics is because of what the substance is providing for them. It's providing relief from pain and suffering. It's giving them a feeling of connection. It might be the only thing that brings them back into their bodies and helps them feel grounded. Maybe it helps them find their power or their voice. Maybe it's a way to check out during a really unbearable time in their life. Maybe it's a way to silence their overthinking minds, right? Like the substance is providing something. It's temporary relief from something, which is why people keep coming back to it. And then their kids, through modeling, learn that substances are what you need when you're going through a hard time. And then their children learn the same until someday someone in the family is like, hey guys, this is really dysfunctional. I'm going to work on myself. And even if some children don't witness substance abuse in the home, their own experiences of emotional abandonment might lead them to seek relief from substances, right? So it's not just about what's modeled in the family in terms of drinking or drug use. It can also be what's modeled in the family in terms of emotional regulation. So a quote from this book, Complex PTSD by Pete Walker, on page 95, he says, the emotional hunger that comes from parental abandonment often morphs over time into an insatiable appetite for substances and or addictive processes. When the survivor has no understanding of the effects of trauma or no memory of being traumatized, addictions are often understandable, misplaced attempts to regulate painful emotional flashbacks. It's not actually about the substance. It's about what the substance provides. And then it's modeled, and then it starts running in families. We can't just say it's genetic. So even though generations maybe have lived out these similar patterns, the dysfunction has become ingrained, woven into the fabric of the family to the extent that any family member who dares to challenge or point out the dysfunction is usually labeled as disloyal or they're othered in some kind of way. They become the black sheep of the family sometimes. And ironically, I've seen this in my own family as well. Family members often bond over the generational repetition of pain and dysfunction. I've seen that with my dad and his dad, this bonding over these generational wounds and hard hearts that they both carry. So most families don't even have an awareness of a concept like ancestral trauma. It's not easy to become aware of unhealthy patterns that may very well have been the norm for your family for many generations. And yet, awareness of this is the only way to break these cycles in our families and ourselves and for future generations. If you're anything like me, you're doing this work and you're already the black sheep of your family. Like, I'm such a weirdo in my family. Everybody thinks I talk like a therapist and that I just want to like talk about feelings and communicate all day. And really, it's not that at all. In fact, I would love to not talk like a therapist and I would love to not talk about feelings and communicate all day, but we haven't figured out how to be around each other in a functional way yet. And it's not because I'm not trying. It's not because I'm not working on myself. It requires their participation and reciprocity as well. So now I want to do a little segue because Again, remember, this is probably the topic I am the least informed about, but I don't think that any discussion on ancestral trauma is complete without bringing up concepts like colonization and Christianization. Our collective history, worldwide history, is shockingly full of stories of pale-skinned people placing themselves in power over people of color, taking away their land, their traditions, and their culture, and claiming it for themselves or eradicating it. Too often, Indigenous people were forced, under threat of death, to convert to Christianity, and sometimes they converted and were killed anyway. So we can hold that sickening and sobering reality and also hold another truth. And that is that pale-skinned people have done this exact same thing to each other too. And dark-skinned people have done this exact same thing to each other too. I am a person of white. I don't believe in constructs like white, but okay. I'm a person of white, primarily European ancestry, like newsflash, pale skin, blue eyes, was naturally blonde until I had kids and then my hair grew back in dark. But I'm very European, okay? I'm very Scandinavian, French, United Kingdom area, okay? And I do use quotes because I believe that race is a social construct. And when I describe myself, I don't see any reason to include the color of my skin. And when I describe others, I don't see any reason to include the color of their skin. So moving on, many of my ancestors definitely colonized and Christianized the homelands of people of color. And they also colonized and Christianized the homeland of people whose skin was pale like theirs. And through this participation of harm done to others, my ancestors unknowingly harmed themselves and their descendants. Because colonization doesn't only harm the colonized, it also harms the colonizer for future generations afterwards. Colonizers like my ancestors and like your ancestors, because guess what? We all have colonizer ancestors and we all have colonized ancestors. But colonizers like some of my ancestors lost their own cultural identities, traditions, practices, and even language as they stole the land, identity, and heritage from those they colonized. Because my pale-skinned ancestors participated in settler colonialism, I have zero connection to my roots, culture, land, spirituality, or any ancestral traditions. No clue. I have strong ancestral ties to the Scottish Highlands. I deeply desire to connect with, learn about, and revive and practice the pre-Christian practices and rituals of my Highlander ancestors. Except I can't find much historical information on what those pre-Christian traditions were. So although my Scottish ancestors were white, they were also invaded, colonized, and Christianized by white people. First the ancient Romans, and then later the British. The traditions of my Scottish Highlander ancestors, my white ancestors, were eradicated and outlawed by their colonizers, rendering them lost to history. And perhaps some resources exist and I haven't found them yet. But centuries later, I long to connect with the traditions of my ancestors and I have no clue what I'm doing. And I'm so afraid of appropriating something and, fucking getting canceled. But it's like a lot of people of color actually have much more connection to their roots and their traditions than a lot of pale-skinned people do. I bet if you dug around in your lineage, you would probably have a similar problem. A loss of connection to ancestral traditions, rituals, language, dress, medicines, and land is just as much ancestral trauma as generational alcoholism, generational poverty, generational codependency, generational abuse. Like it's a generational disconnect from literally who your people are. That's a fucking loss. We all have that loss in some way. We are all collectively and individually victims of exploitive systems like corporate capitalism, religion, the system of patriarchy, and colonialism. The symptoms that we experience individually and collectively are proof of a lineage of the pain inflicted by misogyny, white supremacy, corporate capitalism, dislocation of land, greed, power, war, etc. All of our ancestors were indigenous to some place. All of our ancestors were indigenous to some place. So healing from the pain inflicted by the overculture that you and I as individuals literally have no control over, it's going to look different for different individuals, right? But collective healing begins with an awareness of the pain, grieving the loss of what these systems have taken from us, and then rebuilding, reviving, and rekindling our connection to ourselves, our ancestors, and our land. So how do we take all of this generational pain, right? Like this feels like such a big topic. How do we take this and alchemize it into ancestral nourishment? As I thought about this really hard whenever I was writing the book, Nourish Your Nervous System, this was the chapter that gave me the most trouble. I had the hardest time finding my words with this chapter. I had the hardest time wrapping my head around certain things, figuring out how I was going to articulate what I wanted to say, figuring out what was appropriate to include, what was inappropriate to include, what do I have no business saying, what do I have business saying. Like this was a hard chapter for me. So as I thought about like, okay, how do we take all of this, pain from the individual family systems that we've all been a part of, and also the pain of the overarching overculture of systems that we have absolutely no control over, and alchemize it into something that feels nourishing from an ancestral perspective. And that I got two answers. I'm sure there are more answers, but these are the two answers that I got. And I think that both will lead us to deeper ancestral nourishment. So the first answer, the first path that I could see towards alchemizing all of this individual family system pain and collective overculture pain into ancestral nourishment. The first path forward for this that I saw was naming generational adaptive survival responses, naming the fabric of the family. We have to name the generational adaptive survival responses that have become what Mark Wolin calls the family consciousness, right? We've got to take it from being in the shadows and being subconscious and unconscious, and we have to bring it into the light and bring it into consciousness and just name, whoa, this is the family consciousness. Because chronic nervous system dysregulation has both micro and macro sources. The macro sources are systemic and they're institutional. They're the overculture. I'm talking racism, sexism, patriarchy, capitalism. The systems inflict collective harm. It's widespread. It even harms the people who are participating actively in the system. They are harmed as well. The systems inflict collective harm towards marginalized groups such as people of color and women and people who are not able-bodied or neurotypical. And so for generations, these systems have wreaked havoc on humans and on the planet with very little accountability or consequences. And we have to acknowledge where and how these corrupt systems have caused and continue to cause very real harm, leaving individuals powerless and fighting amongst each other when the real enemy is the overculture. So let's hypothetically say a situation that could have happened to any of our ancestors, depending on where they were from. So perhaps to survive a mass trauma, an overculture trauma. Your ancestors had to sell off, or they lost everything they had, and they adapted by scrimping and saving as much as they could to survive. So as a group, your ancestors may have been persecuted, invaded, colonized by a country, colonized or invaded by a religion, a regime, and they lost their belongings and wealth. So motivated by greed and power, the puppets of the overculture, the institutionalized systems, so that would be noblemen, military figures, royalty, Catholic priests, Nazi generals, right? Those are just some examples of the puppets of the institutionalized systems, the puppets of the overculture. They led exploits to take the lands and people, resulting in the loss of indigenous power and agency, whoever was indigenous to that land. So a prevalent historical example of what I'm talking about is the Nazi persecution of the entire Jewish nation. The Third Reich was an institution. It was the overculture, a system of greed and power, and it utterly and completely took away the generational homes, possessions, wealth, and well-being of an entire people group. Studies are still being conducted today on the potential genetic impacts the Holocaust had on the living descendants of survivors. Still to this day. Even if generations later, somewhere along the line, some descendants came into some good luck or they started a successful business, that pattern of having to live in scarcity was likely already well established in many of them, and necessarily so. Because when wealth comes into a family who previously had to scrimp and save every last penny and crumb, the family doesn't simply forget the scrimping and saving pattern. It's like many of our ancestors lived through an apocalypse of sorts, depending on where they were and what time period they were living in, when that original trauma happened, right? But it changed their physiology and their emotional landscape and their brain so drastically that it has echoed down for generations. You may have witnessed this in your own family, or maybe even in movies. When systems of power take over, they tend to confiscate and control the resources of their victims, right? So they orchestrate these actions, which are then executed by presidents, kings, militaries, noblemen, generals, whatever. How did our ancestors survive that? Well, they had to adapt in many, many ways. And often generations after them have lived in those adaptive patterns, even though the original trauma has passed, right? So I have a generational pattern of scarcity from my family. It comes through my maternal line. I don't know if poverty resulted from an overculture thing. I mean, I think poverty is always because of an overculture, but I think sometimes also like people make bad financial decisions, or I've literally had ancestors who bet the farm and lost it. And so that's not really an overculture problem. That's an individual family system issue. So I don't know if my family's poverty was because of an individual mistake, like betting the farm and losing it, or if it was more of an overculture, a byproduct of living under the overculture that caused the poverty. But my grandmother, Edith, the one that I showed you earlier, she was the youngest of 6 children, and she was born at the very beginning of the Great Depression. Her mother's name was Thelma, and Thelma was an incomeless housewife, and her father, Bert, was a farmer. When my grandmother grew up, poverty followed her, and they were very poor. Like a farmer in Central Texas in the Great Depression was very poor. My family on my mother's side were not wealthy landowners. My family on my father's side were wealthy landowners, interestingly enough. So when my Meemaw Edith grew up, poverty followed her. And even after she married her third husband, and they opened their own business together, and they were doing well financially, and they made a nice living, she still lived as if she was a penniless pauper. I vividly remember some of Meemaw's quirks, which I now recognize as adaptive survival responses. So one of her quirks was she kept every last plastic container and glass jar. She would keep wax paper and parchment paper and aluminum foil, and she would clean them and meticulously fold the foil or fold the wax paper to place it nicely in the drawer. She would clean and dry Ziploc baggies and save them. And to this day, I still wash and keep my baggies, and I reuse my parchment paper and foil. And my husband chuckles at me because I'm exactly like my grandmother in this way. And I'm not saying that treating everything as trash and disposing of it is the way to heal the scarcity mindset. Like, I don't think we go from scrimping and saving into like waste and say that that's healing, because it's not. I appreciate that my Mima was frugal, and I appreciate that her frugality meant less waste was going into landfills, and it also saved her money. And also, I recognize how growing up in poverty affected her for her entire life. And I recognize how her growing up in poverty and then raising my mom and my mom growing up in poverty affected my mom. And even when my grandmother had opportunities to live more easily and without struggle, she still found ways to scrimp and save even when she didn't have to. Now, my Mima's older sister, her favorite sister, my great aunt Geneva, married a wealthy man, and they never had children. In comparison to my Mima, Aunt Geneva lived lavishly. She and her husband drove luxury cars. They lived in an expensive home in Phoenix. The only time I ever visited Aunt Geneva, I was in the 4th grade, and I remember that she served us orange sherbet and sugar cookies on crystal plates in a crystal bowl. And to me, that was the height of fanciness and wealth. When Aunt Geneva passed away, she left her accumulated wealth, which I think was around $300,000, to my Mima, because my Mima was the only person in her family left because she didn't have any children. And my Mima felt guilty for receiving the money. She always would cry anytime you talked about her having anything, or anytime you talked about her sister, or if you talked about her money or anything. My Mima would cry, and she would say, I would give it all back to have my sister again. And anytime my grandmother had to pay a large bill or make a big purchase, she would bring up how she would rather have another moment with her sister than have her sister's money. Eventually, my grandmother used some of her inheritance, and she left her very rickety, worn down home in a bad neighborhood, and she was able to pay cash for a much better home in a much nicer neighborhood, because my Mima was a smoker, which is another adaptive survival pattern that runs in my family, is smoking. All of her furniture was caked in tar and nicotine. So when she bought her new house, which was literally just like a 3-bedroom, 1,500 square foot house, she also replaced some of her pieces of furniture. But like, that's as much as she would ever allow herself to receive. She knew how to live in scarcity. Mima knew how to pinch pennies. She knew how to go without. That lifestyle was safe to her because it was familiar. Except once she had plenty of money and no longer needed to be so rigid and frugal, her nervous system didn't automatically feel safe and nourished by the big sum in her checking account. Having money for her felt unfamiliar, and therefore it was unsafe. I mean, my Mima was in her early 70s when her sister passed away. Like, she had lived more than 70 years of her life in complete poverty. And only in the last 10 years of her life did she have anything that was comfortable. You know, the poverty was much more familiar to her nervous system than the plenty was. My Mima never felt safe to let her defenses down with money, even once she passed away in 2011. And then out of necessity, this pattern became the family consciousness, and it continued even after members of our family worked their way out of poverty. Even me now, when I have a robust 5 figures in my bank account and I know I can rely on myself to provide financially, something still feels like it's not enough. And it's not a lust for wealth and greed and power that drives this feeling. Like, I am grateful I objectively have enough. But it comes from generations of women in my lineage who were physically, emotionally, and financially malnourished, and who had to keep going and figure out how to feed their children and pay the light bill. Or in my Mima's case, squirrel away money so that she could leave an abusive husband, which she had too. So for me, when I look at that figure in my bank account, even when everybody else would say, Lindsey, you have enough, like it's good, you're okay, there's still this sense of, oh, but what if it's not enough? And it's not, no, I need more so that I can buy more, or I need more to have more wealth. It's not coming from that place. It comes from a really, really tender place. I am so open to my body healing more around this scarcity, because it has been a big one for me. It's something that I continue to work on a lot, actually. It's like it's in my blood to pinch pennies, even when I don't have to. But my dad's side is a bit different. As I mentioned, his side of the family were wealthy landowners in Central Texas during the late 1800s, all through the mid 1900s, and they were plantation and slave owners in Virginia before that. In fact, you can look this up. The last shots of the Civil War were fired at Lockett Farms at the Battle of Sailor's Creek. Sayler'', the Battle of Sailor's Creek, Lockett Farms. During World War II, my great-grandfather, Vernon, who owned over 1,200 acres in Central Texas, he raised sheep for wool, and he sold the wool to the U.S. military, and the military used his wool to make uniforms for soldiers during the war, and that's how my great-grandfather became really wealthy. Interestingly, as I mentioned before, the men in my direct paternal lineage have all suffered from heart disease. So my great-grandfather and his father, my great-great-grandfather, both died from heart attacks. Two of my great-grandfather's older brothers died from heart attacks in their 40s. My grandfather, who recently passed away, he's the oldest living ancestor of anyone in his family. He lived to be 94, but he had a pacemaker to keep his heart beating and a stent that kept an artery open. My dad, who is still living, thankfully, has high blood pressure and COPD, and I have an older brother who we weren't raised in the same home, and he's 10 years older than me, but he has high blood pressure. And all of these men had or have a heart arrhythmia. Okay, is it genetics that Lockett men have heart and chest problems? Sure, maybe. But knowing what I know about trauma and unprocessed and unfelt emotion and nervous system malnourishment, I get an intuitive sense that the heart dis-ease in my paternal line is related to more than just genetic expression. Especially after having spent time with several of these men, I notice a lot of unintegrated anger in how they tell stories and talk about the wrongs they've endured throughout their lives. It's as if my paternal lineage doesn't know how to forgive and let go of their hurts, especially when those hurts come from some sort of perceived injustice. They retell the same stories as if they're still trying to work something out, and it's like their hearts are broken and sick because of it. Of course, I can't prove any of this scientifically, but I'm not looking to prove any of this with science and medicine. I simply notice this potential pattern, and I make note of a potential traumatic pattern in my paternal lineage. Isn't it interesting, right? I just bring curiosity into it. Isn't it interesting that the men in my paternal line have similar health problems and similar emotional states? I don't believe that's coincidental. So, a long time ago, I said, two paths that I could see for alchemizing all of this generational pain into ancestral nourishment, and looking at our lineages and naming the adaptive survival responses that have been passed down, I think is a great first step. And whether it was caused by a collectively catastrophic event, such as the Holocaust, or we were simply born into families that have generationally similar struggles and responses to those struggles, trauma and trauma responses run in families. The second path that I see for deeper ancestral nourishment is to foster some sort of connection with our ancestors, whether or not we know their names or their stories. In most pre-Christian indigenous traditions, there is a strong connection between the living and the dead. I am not only speaking of Native American traditions. Indigenous Mexican cultures, Old Norse, African, and many Asian traditions have strong teachings and practices that honor ancestors. I'm a history nerd, so I have researched my ancestry and mapped my family tree, I have discovered ancestors from Scandinavia, the Scottish Highlands, all over what is now the United Kingdom, France, and Germany. And once I learned where my ancestors lived, I started studying plants native to those regions, such as stinging nettles, mugwort, and plantain. And the very plants that my witch grandmothers and aunties would have used for food, medicines, rituals, and spells, many of them actually grow where I live today. It's really special. So when I gather and dry mugwort, I feel a sense of connection to a lineage of women who also would have gathered and dried mugwort for medicinal and spiritual uses. When I chew a bit of plantain leaf in my mouth and then spread it on a mosquito bite in a paste, I remember my ancestors who would have done the same thing. I've also learned a bit about what was happening historically, and I have been able to imagine some of the challenges that my ancestors faced that caused the traumas and the generational survival patterns. The British occupation of the Scottish Highlands is one, the bubonic plague is another, and the challenges of pioneers and colonists in what is now the Americas is another one. So creating a connection with our ancestors requires accepting that we are never going to have all the information. We're never going to know everything. We are never going to know all the names, all the places, all the stories, all the traumas. It can be enough to recognize and honor the thousands of people who lived so you could be born. Their traumas are etched in your body, but as I mentioned earlier, so is their strength and their resilience. And if they had not been resilient, you would not exist. In the book Ancestral Medicine, Dr. Four explains that we cannot and should not try to heal everything our ancestors went through. When I first started learning about ancestral trauma, and this happens for many people, I had this weird belief that it was my sole responsibility to heal everything I possibly could in my family line, and that through enough research into my heritage, I could figure out all the traumas my ancestors lived through and heal it. That is my savior complex. That is unrealistic. It's not your responsibility. It's not possible. According to Daniel 4, our ancestors who are well in spirit have a healing influence on ancestors who are not well in spirit. And he teaches that it is unwise to attempt to connect with ancestors who might not be well in spirit while we are in our human form. However, we can speak to the cloud of ancestors who are well in spirit, whether or not we know all of their information. We don't need science to tell us that it's possible. Our faith in the process is enough. So now I want to share a really special personal story about my Meemaw, cancel culture, and hummingbirds. When I started sitting with the possibility several years ago that I could foster a connection between myself and my ancestors, even if I didn't know their names or their birthplaces, I naturally started with the ancestor that I knew the most about and who I actually had a relationship with, which was my Meemaw. I decided that my symbol for her would be a hummingbird. And when I saw a hummingbird, especially if it was an unexpected or an unusual place, that would be my sign that she was present with me, that she was watching over me, loving on me from the other side. I began seeing hummingbirds in the unlikeliest of places. Then, during the winter of 2021, I endured a harsh online cancellation. Part of this cancellation were people who were accusing me of being part of QAnon, of recruiting people for the NXIVM sex cult, of doing all kinds of crazy, of being in a cancel culture cult. Like, it was crazy. Yeah, what a time, man. What a time. I repeatedly reported these accounts on Instagram for harassment. I reported them for bullying. Their content clearly violated Instagram's terms of service and community guidelines. I reported these accounts for copyright infringement. My followers reported them. I blocked them, but they had burner accounts and I couldn't find their burner accounts to block them. And so they would come back into my space and continue harassing me. It was insane. Like, God, what a time. Suffice it to say, I did everything that I could in the earthly realm of boundaries to stop this madness. I mean, they were literally defaming me and like slandering me. I wanted to stop their rumors, but it continued. And finally, I decided, you know what? I've done everything in the earthly realm that I can do. It's time to take this into the ethers and do some spell work and some magic. So this was in February of 2022. I searched on Spotify for a random spiritual playlist and I hit play. I couldn't even tell you the name of the playlist now. I have no idea what it was. Then I set out this photo of my Mima and a few oracle cards. I placed a circle of candles alternating with crystals around myself, symbolizing an impenetrable barrier around me to protect me. I sat in the middle of that circle of stone and fire on the floor. I opened my hands and I prayed. Universe, spirit guides, light beings, and any ancestors who are well in spirit, if you're out there, please help. Please help me cleanse myself and protect myself and my online space from these rumors and this online harassment. Place energetic boundaries around me and protect me from this nonsense. Send these people out of my space. May it be so. Then I wrote my name on one side of a piece of paper and the names of the cancelers on the other side. And to symbolize that I was cutting them and their energy out of my life, I tore the piece of paper in half and separated our names. I prayed that the cancelers would be well and whole, and I put an energetic boundary in place that denied them access to my Instagram account, my energy, my business, my space. And next, I burned the pieces of paper with their names. I blew out the candles. I put my crystals back where they belonged, and I walked over to my computer to turn off the random playlist. The song that was playing at that moment when I hit stop on the playlist was called Hummingbird. So I glanced at my photo of Mima, I smiled, and I whispered, "Thank you for being here. Thank you for protecting me." And I shit you not, the cancellation that had been going on for over a year stopped. Stopped. Seriously. After that ritual, I never heard from the people again. There was not another rumor. There was not another screenshot of my content. There was no more harassment. I don't have a shred of scientific proof that my Mima and other ancestors helped me with this, but I also don't have a shred of scientific proof that they didn't. People pay psychics and mediums a lot of money to receive messages and signs from dead relatives. I might do it one day myself. I haven't yet, but don't put it past me. Until that time comes, I want to create meaningful threads of connection to those who came before me. And I believe that by simply inviting them in when they're well and being open to whatever healing might want to come through, any healing that's meant to happen will happen. I don't know how it works, but I believe that fostering a conscious connection with our ancestors opens us up to receive love, protection, healing, and wisdom from the other side. So to end this episode, I want to share with you 8 practical ways that you can foster a connection to your ancestors. And if you've never connected with an ancestor before, you could literally implement one of these 8 things today and start. Just be really intentional about the ancestors that you call in and make sure you specify that you're calling in ancestors who are well in spirit. Nobody can come unless you call them in. So you don't have to worry about the ancestors who aren't well in spirit, because they're not like the ghost or the boogeyman that are going to come and get you. So here are 8 practical ways to foster a connection to your ancestors. Number 1, research your ancestry and build a family tree. You can use websites like Ancestry.com. I also really like FamilySearch.org. FamilySearch.org is run by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but because of their beliefs about ancestry and families and planets and heaven and reincarnation and all of that, they keep damn good records. I've actually found a lot through FamilySearch.org. So just researching your ancestry and kind of getting a family tree going can be really beneficial in connecting with your ancestors. Number 2, way to connect with your ancestors. Ask your living relatives to share anything they remember about your ancestors with you and write it down as they share it. And then tell those stories to your kids or write them down and give them to your kids. I'm so grateful for my dad and his nerdiness and love of genealogy and history and ancestry that we share together, because my dad is like a gold mine of stories and he still has his memory and he remembers a lot. And so I'm just soaking up all the stories that he can share with me, because most of his ancestors are dead. So they're not around for me to ask anymore. So ask your living relatives to share anything that they remember about your ancestors with you. Third, Put photos of your ancestors on your mantle, your altar, or another place of honor in your home. You could even put up a shelf that just has pictures of your ancestors. You could do an ancestor wall in a hallway or in a foyer or an entryway. Just put some photos up, talk about them, remember them. The fourth way to foster a connection with your ancestors is to visit your ancestors' graves or their past residences. You can leave a small offering, such as wildflowers, a piece of chocolate, a crystal, some dried herbs, some salt, or one of your ancestors' favorite foods on their grave. In January of 2023, I actually went and visited my dad in Central Texas, and he took me to a cemetery where many, many, many of my Lockett ancestors are buried. I had totally forgotten to bring any kind of offering with me, but I had a bag of peanut M&Ms. And so I left a peanut M&M on every single one of the graves of the people that I was related to as my offering. Now I do a much better job of traveling and keeping offering stuff with me. I usually take dried herbs because they're easy to travel with. Fifth way to foster a connection with your ancestors is to call on your ancestors who are well in spirit when you are praying for help, protection, or guidance. When I call on my ancestors, I say, I call on any ancestors who are well in spirit to support, protect, and guide me. So if you pray to God, if you pray to spirit guides, if you talk to spirit guides or gods or goddesses or light beings or whoever you talk to, you can add your ancestors in with that. They're part of all of that anyway. The sixth way to foster a connection with your ancestors is during special family dinners or holidays, you can place small bits of food on a plate and put that little plate on your altar, your mantle, or at an empty seat at the table. In our local community, whenever we do this, we call this the ancestor plate. And it's just a way of saying, here, ancestors, is an offering of the little bits of food that we're having. We welcome you here. We're so grateful you're here. We give this offering to you to honor you. And then after the meal, you can compost the bits of food or you can offer them back to the earth. The seventh way to foster a connection to your ancestors is don't be too quick to throw out your ancestors' belongings, even if you're not sentimental. And I am like the least sentimental person. I have thrown away so much stuff that I now quasi regret. Like part of me is like, no, I'm glad I haven't hauled that thing all over the place. But then the other part of me is like, But even if you're not sentimental, don't be too quick to throw out your ancestors' stuff. You don't have to hoard everything, but there are certain items that are really nice to have and they're really nice to pass down. Things like photos, jewelry, art, especially if they made the art, quilts or other handcrafted things, items of clothing, if they're in good shape, tools that they may have used. Like, those are really special to keep and pass down. I have one of my Mima's custom design rings. I'm actually wearing it right now. My Mima designed this ring. It is gold. It's a rose. It is one of my favorites. I love it. I also have Mima's cast iron skillet, and I have the green Tupperware bowl that she used to make chocolate pudding in whenever I visited her. I don't use it in the kitchen anymore because it started getting a little bit brittle, so now it just sits in my office. And when my dad passes away, I'm supposed to get the bodice of his grandmother's wedding dress, which is framed and hanging in his house. And I'm also supposed to get his grandmother's daisy butter churn, which is sitting on top of my dad's refrigerator. So those are the types of things that I will definitely keep. I won't get rid of them in a garage sale or whenever I move. They're the types of things that I really want to have around as heirlooms. When my grandfather passed away this last spring, I was able to go through his house, and his wife had passed away some time before, but she had some fur coats in her closet, and we were all the girls were allowed to pick a fur coat to take home. So I got a real mink coat out of it, which I'm definitely not going to get rid of that, right? So the eighth and final way that you can foster a connection to your ancestors is to do what I did and come up with a special symbol to represent an ancestor to you, like I did with the hummingbird for my Mima. And then whenever you see that symbol, you can acknowledge that your relative is nearby and you can thank them for being with you. If you don't have a symbol, you could choose a number, right? Every time I see 1111, whether it's on a clock or it's on the number of likes on my Instagram post, or it's, the amount at the grocery store, whatever. Anytime I see 4 ones in a row, that's going to be my sign that great grandpa, whoever, is like watching over me or guiding me from the other side. So that is what I have in terms of ancestral nourishment. I continue to be on my own journey of ancestral nourishment. In fact, just recently I had a coaching call with my coach, and we did a little bit of ancestor work, and my dad's paternal grandmother, Hazel, whose bodice of her wedding dress is framed at his house, she came through. She came through as the symbol of an eye. And the message that I've gotten from that so far is that I think Granny Hazel either wants me to see something or wants to give me the gift of sight. And I don't know if that's like psychic sight, like clairvoyant sight, maybe spiritual sight. I'm not really sure, but she came through as eyes, and I'm still trying to discern and figure out what's going on with that. But yeah, I'm regularly doing ancestor work, and I do it in phases. Sometimes I get really excited and I'll dive into my ancestry on my family tree website and nerd out on that for a few weeks in the afternoons or in the evenings, and then I'll drop it for 6 months and not come back to it. But I always have Mima's picture on my desk, and I have different photos of my ancestors around my house, and so they're never far. We do ancestor plates at dinner, especially family dinners, special dinners, and holiday dinners. And yeah, I don't throw away as many items anymore, and I have my dad tell me stories. So I hope this episode was helpful. I would love to know if you know more than I do about ancestral healing and ancestral trauma, connecting with ancestors. Like, please share in the comments. Give me your resources. Give me your YouTube channels. Like, tell me all about it, because it's something I'm so interested in. I appreciate you for being here. You can check out my book, Nourish Your Nervous System, lindseylockett.com/nourish. You can download it as an ebook and an audiobook. I narrate the audiobook. It's over 7 hours long, so it's a full-length audiobook for less than $20. You can also hit the follow button. You can like my channel. You can like my podcast. You can leave a 5-star rating. That would be really amazing, especially if you're listening on Spotify. It always helps whenever you leave good ratings on the show. And also, if you're on Apple Podcasts, you can leave a written review and a star rating. And that is also very, very helpful. Thank you so much for being here. Stay tuned for the next episode in the Nourish Your Nervous System podcast and video series. That'll be coming out really soon. And the topic is, I saved the best for last, emotional nourishment. That's where we're headed next. Bye-bye. Thank you so much for listening all the way to the end of this episode. Stay in touch with me by joining my email list at lindseylockett.com/email. And feel free to follow along on Instagram at I am Lindsey Lockett. Finally, you can check out all of my offerings, including courses, private coaching, and workshops on my website at lindseylockett.com.